What's going on YouTube, and welcome to this video where we're going to be going over all of the proposed combat changes that are slated to come out into the live game at the end of February 2026, which is only 3.5 weeks away. So we're coming up on this pretty quickly. On the 30th of January, a combat beta was released that anybody can log into and play at any point to give feedback on a lot of the proposed changes. And along with that, we've also got a news post that outlines every single change, all of the abilities that have been completely removed from Runescape, and all of the brand new abilities that they're hoping to introduce. If you're wondering why I didn't make this video a few days ago when the beta came out, it's because I've noticed that almost all of the coverage I've seen on this beta has been very endgame focused. It's been a lot of endgame people doing endgame things and then picking apart or saying that they like the things in the endgame and how it impacts the endgame. But in reality, RuneScape is about a lot more than just endgame players with legendary weapons and 20 bill banks killing bosses at max efficiency. And in reality, a lot of the purpose of this beta, as they've outlined, is all about making the combat system more smooth and easier to understand and get into in the early game and in the mid game as well. So because of that, while I did spend 5 or 6 hours playing around with my endgame setup, I also wanted to do my due diligence, and I spent a significant amount of time with level 90 stats and level 90 gear, and then last but not least, I actually reset my account stats to 1, and I actually played my way through all of the 3 core combat styles from 1 all the way up to the mid 40s and 50s and 60s, so I could actually get a read on if these changes actually make combat better for a prospective new player. I'll also say I'm not surprised that a lot of the commentary has been very endgame focused, a lot of the creators are very endgame, and when you go to a community like Reddit, you're still going to find a lot of people on there that have been playing RuneScape for a very long time. But the reality of the situation and what the data backs is that over the years and over time, RuneScape has lost players due to the nature of the combat system, and you kind of need to go through a lot of tribulations and a lot of unfun stuff and a lot of underpoweredness to get to an endgame that for a lot of people that got there really enjoy. I'm personally somebody that really likes the endgame of RS3's combat, but the reality is this: for a lot of the player base, combat is too confusing, combat is hard to get into, and the reality is, whether it's for good reasons or for bad reasons, a lot of people do not like RS3 because of the combat. So with that said, let's talk about this beta and let's get into it. I'm going to read through the entire news post, and I'll also let you know what I think about all of these different changes, both from an endgame perspective, but also talking a whole lot about what this was like in the early game on my brand new account that had level 1 stats. Before we jump in, I also wanted to quickly say, if you're not subscribed to the channel, don't forget to subscribe for more RuneScape content. And outside of that, let's go through this news post. I've also linked this news post in the description down below, and if you want to play the beta yourself, just go to this page and scroll all the way to the bottom. And all the way at the bottom of the page, there will be a link to play the beta yourself. You just click on this link here and it will just launch it up. You can import the save from your main account, and then you should be good to go. It's also really cool that if you don't have gear or you want to set your stats to a particular amount or a particular level, you can actually do that as well inside the beta, as there are NPCs there that you can just talk to change your stats and also to give you gear for free. I'm going to paraphrase the header here a little bit because we've covered the combat changes in a lot of detail in previous videos, but basically they want to resolve a number of issues with combat and the player journey. They've got a lot of bloat, a lot of mismatched design, a lot of legacy systems, and there's just a lot of confusion and a lot of noob traps in current combat. And while necromancy is a bit of a scary buzzword and a lot of people don't like necromancy, the reality is this: over 50% of players use necromancy for their combat because it's an easier style to get into and understand. And a big part of this combat beta is taking key learnings from necromancy about what people like about combat and seeing if there's anything they can do in the early and the mid game to make the other styles play a little bit more similarly to necromancy, not in terms of what the abilities do or how they work necessarily or how the style feels, but with regard to not having quite as many abilities, having some very, very simple, obvious, use this and then this combos that players really seem to like. And on top of that, just making sure that the power is on par with necromancy, because part of the reason why necromancy is so popular is because necromancy is ridiculously powerful until the very end game, where all of the other styles kind of become a little bit more feasible. But in the early and the mid game, necromancy outperforms everything else by a long shot, and that is a huge problem. If I'm a new player getting into a medieval fantasy MMO and I get told there's this new style called necromancy and it's the only one worth using, and I really want it to be a ranger or a meleeer or a mage, that's going to absolutely suck, and there's going to be a bit of a reckoning there. And I think for a lot of new players, people feel very pigeonholed into necromancy or feel very forced to play as a necromancer, even if they wouldn't want to, because it feels like the only valid or the only good option. So with that said, that's sort of the vision and a lot of the things that they are trying to change. As a quick disclaimer, before we really get into the weeds on this, I did want to mention this is, of course, all beta, it's all work in progress, and none of this is finalized or coming into the game as is. The whole point of this beta is for people to give feedback and for them to make changes and release different iterations of the beta until it is perfect and people are happy with it. And that's why you're going to see me giving a lot of constructive feedback and not a lot of like freaking out because there's a change that I don't like. Now is the time for giving feedback, so that is exactly what I'm doing. To start things off, let's talk about Range, because Range had its own dedicated beta in December of 2025, and this is now the second iteration of the Range changes. So they've had a chance to walk back some changes from the last time, make some massive modifications, add some new abilities, do some refinement, and overall, in a lot of ways, Range felt the most polished of the three styles, but of course, there were still some things that I was not happy about whatsoever, and we'll talk about all of them right now. Let's start by talking about the range combat style, where they've decided that the identity of the style is going to be leaning in to on-hit effects, which means you want to maximize the amount of hit splats that you're dealing to maximize your damage. In order to do this, they've added two new abilities called Imbue Gales and Imbue Shadows, and we'll talk about them in detail a little further on. But we're going to start off by talking about the abilities that they have chosen to completely remove to make that ability book look a little less busy. They're removing Unload, they're removing Rout, they're removing Salt the Wound, Dazing Shot, Tight Bindings, Demoralize, and Needle Strike. I don't think there are any hugely controversial ones here. Obviously, by far the most used abilities in this group would be Dazing Shot and Needle Strike, and they're kind of just basic ability builders that also have an added effect. Particularly if you were someone that played the game during the range meta with crossbows in 2021, Needle Strike was a very important ability, but these days it's definitely less used than it used to be. Overall, I'm on board with all of these ability removals. There isn't any singular ability here where I'm like, man, I really wish we could continue to have this ability, and I'm kind of okay with this. One other thing you're going to see as we go through all the styles is that they have removed all of the threshold tier stun abilities. And the reason for this is they've replaced it by making the basic ability stun have multiple charges. So if you need to stun something twice or stun two different things, instead of having to use your basic ability and then your threshold ability that costs adrenaline, instead, you'll just be able to use your basic ability stun twice. Next up, you're going to see abilities reinstated, and there you're going to see Shadow Tendrils, because in the first range beta that I also covered in a video, Shadow Tendrils was completely removed, and a lot of players wanted it back, and as you can see here, they have added it back, which I'm honestly personally very on board with. I think Shadow Tendrils has been a pretty cool ability, and it's one of the abilities that feels really good to press. You get a massive hit splat, it's satisfying, and I'm glad to see it come back. With that said, they've also made some changes to a number of existing abilities, and this is where you're going to see a lot of really core fundamental changes to the way that ranged plays. The first big change they've made here is that Ricochet now works a lot more similarly to Greater Ricochet, albeit with significantly less damage and fewer targets as well. And along with this, they've also disabled the Corroming perk, which I actually think is a huge win too. What this means is the functionality of Ricochet and Greater Ricochet remain the same. Greater Ricochet still is your most powerful ranged basic ability, and it's incredibly good, especially when we get a little bit further on into here, and you'll see some of the synergies they're building around it. But it means when you're using Ricochet as a lower leveled player, it is not a noob trap. You're not using it on a single target and just getting absolutely no damage because you need it to build adrenaline. Now, when you hit Ricochet and it can't find additional targets, they're all going to hit the main target and you'll get significantly more damage. This is a change I'm really happy with because then the jump from regular Ricochet to Greater Ricochet is a little bit less extreme. Gricko is still very powerful, but regular Ricochet is no longer a noob trap. When looking at the tooltips, you'll see what they've done as well is that regular Ricochet will hit up to 2 additional enemies within 5 tiles, and then Greater Ricochet will hit up to 6 additional enemies within 5 tiles of the target, and then of course, if it can't find any of those enemies, they're all going to go on your main target, which is exactly what it does in the live game right now. Basically what they've done here is they've taken Corroming out of the equation, and as someone who's a bit of an invention hater, I'm personally very okay with this. I think if they want to make sure that Corroming remains a thing, they could do some interesting things where you get extra targets, or maybe you get additional range or additional damage for having the Corroming perk, but in my opinion, it is smoother and easier to just bake it into the ability itself, and that way we don't need to worry about a Corroming switch. But what's next? This one is also very big. They have now changed Incendiary Shot and removed it and replaced it with Imbue Shadows. It reads, to fully play into Range's on-hit effects, we've replaced Incendiary Shot with a self-buff that generates additional adrenaline on hit. This serves to cement on-hit within Range's core ability kit while reducing Range's reliance on crit so that additional complexity via ammo and weapon passives can build upon that core framework and allow for more interesting reward design. And here's what it does. Imbue your weapon with Dark Whispers, and it applies Imbue's Shadows to self for 30 seconds. What this does is every ranged hit that you get an extra 5% adrenaline. So that's not per ability, it's per hit. And the distinction there is very important because, as an example, if you scroll back up to Greater Ricochet is going to hit 7 times. Because it hits 7 times, you're going to get 9% adrenaline by default because it's a basic ability. And then on top of that 9% adrenaline, you're also going to get an additional 7 times 5% adrenaline, or an extra 35% adrenaline, just like that. And it's going to be consistent every single time you use it, so long as you've imbued shadows. In playing with Imbued Shadows, there were a couple things I really liked about it, and a couple things I didn't like quite as much. First off, I really like that range isn't critical strike chance locked at this point, because in core combat in the original 3 styles, towards the end game, a lot of the time you feel like you need to be on a Calgarian Demon and using a Grimoire, or you're just losing out on damage, and to me, it's a little bit boring and a little bit monotonous that all 3 styles kind of play into the exact same thing. Moving into On Hit is really cool to me, because all of a sudden you can range with a full book, or a Jas book, or a Ramasket book, or anything you want, and you don't necessarily need to lean into crit in order to have adrenaline. The other thing I thought was very interesting about Imbue Shadows is it comes in very late in your progression, as it's a level 90 ability. In my opinion, this is a little bit later than it should be, and I think it'd be very fun if you could start getting adrenaline buffs and start playing with them a little bit earlier on into your progression. Somewhere in the 80s or level 85, to me, makes a little bit more sense. The one other massive change between Imbue Shadows and Incendiary Shot is, as you'll see looking at the tooltip, it only costs 40% adrenaline. And to me, this is a massive win, and this was actually done with Meteor Strike as well, which, as you'll see later on in this news post, has been converted into Melee's adrenaline buff. This is a really big win in my books, because I think for a lot of players, and especially casual players, you wouldn't really be able to use Incendiary Shot at all unless you're either switching to Death Spore arrows, or you're on like a crazy crit build and you have a ton of extra overflow adrenaline. And I think for the average player, a lot of these abilities just felt entirely unattainable to use, because if you use a Death Swiftness and then you build up to Incendiary Shot and then you use it, all of a sudden half of your Death Swiftness has expired and you actually did less damage than you would have done before. Reducing the adrenaline cost to 40 to me just reduces a lot of friction, and it makes it a lot easier to use this ability for the average player, and that's something that I am always going to be a huge fan of. But the one thing that I didn't love about Imbue Shadows is the 30-second duration felt a little bit off to me, especially when you consider that Greater Death Swiftness lasts either 36 or 37 seconds. Because it lasts a little bit longer, there was kind of an awkward period at the end of your Death Swiftness where you just don't have any kind of adrenaline buff, and I was finding I'd frequently end my rotations at basically 0% adrenaline, and then I'd have to build all the way back up by firing monotonous basic abilities until I could get set up for my next rotation, or for using some stronger abilities in the meantime. In my opinion, Imbue Shadows would work a lot better if it lasted ever so slightly longer, even if it was as a leveling benefit. So imagine you unlock it at level 80, but at level 90 it gets a duration increase, and then maybe at level 100 it gets another duration increase. But that's really the only nitpick I have. I actually really liked Imbue Shadows. It felt very fun, it felt very thematically sound, it was good to use, and I think it's going to play a lot better for your average player. But now we're going to get to the first ability of all these changes that I absolutely despised. Bombardment has had its overall adrenaline cost and damage reduced, with a short cooldown added. This allowed it to maintain its primary purpose as an AoE ability. So that's the description, but then when you look at what it actually does, it does 150 to 180% range damage to the target and up to 9 additional enemies within 1 tile of the target. Which, if anybody played Leagues with ranged, I know most people didn't, I did, and it ruined my life. And this is effectively what the ranged relic was. It made all of your attacks work up to 9 enemies within 1 tile. And you'll find out very quickly that this almost never comes up. How many times in RS3 are you going to have 9 enemies, or even 5 enemies, or even 3 enemies within 1 tile of your main target? It happens almost never, and to me, this is just way too weak for an AoE ability and for range's primary AoE ability. So to me, I'm not a fan of this at all, and I think at absolute minimum, they need to make the range of it significantly bigger. Like, I'm talking at least 3 tiles, and you could possibly even go further than that. So yeah, Bombardment, not so great. But now, let's get into the new abilities. The first one is called Imbue Gales, and similarly to Imbue Shadows, it serves as a way to introduce on-hit effects earlier and within the core ability kit of range. It provides a small amount of bonus damage on hit to incentivize using it before high hit count abilities, Rapid Fire and Deadshot in particular. Here's what it does. It's got a 15-second cooldown, and you imbue your weapon with Searing Winds, and it applies Imbued Gales to self. For 4.2 seconds, you're going to deal an extra amount of flat damage per every hit splat you get. So this is your very basic level 58 unlock synergy with on-hit effects. So what you would do is you would use Imbue Gales, and then all of a sudden you want to use things that hit a number of times, like Ricochet or Greater Ricochet, and even things like Snapshot. The other thing about Imbue Gales that wasn't listed at all in this news post, but is a thing, is they've set it up in such a way that it actually pauses the timer on it and keeps the buff active while you're in rapid fire, which obviously is a massive on-hit ability. So it's very clearly leading a player into the synergy of you use Imbue Gales and then you do a full rapid fire under the effects of the Imbue Gales. It's pushing you to synergize this with rapid fire, and then after your rapid fire, you can kind of do whatever you want, prioritizing on hit. If you have the extra adrenaline, Snapshot is great. If you don't have the adrenaline, Ricochet or Greater Ricochet is going to be your best bet. Towards the end game, I didn't feel like this mattered all that much because it's just one of many different things that you can do to kind of self-buff your on hit. Another good example of this would be the Eldritch Crossbow special attack, which kind of does the same thing, more or less. You use it, you apply a buff to yourself, and then every hit, you're going to get some echo damage. They work sort of differently, but it kind of felt like at times I had to use the Eldritch Crossbow special and then use this right after, and then rapid fire, and that got a little bit monotonous. But let me tell you, when I reset my stats and reset my range level to the 60s, I had an absolute blast using Imbue Gales, and this played absolutely phenomenally. It's such an easy to understand synergy, and it's so satisfying to get those combos and Imbue Gales into rapid fire, into Snapshot, into Ricochet. It felt really good to use, it performed very well, and overall, I was really happy with how this played at the early game. It's a good way to get the early game players thinking about on-hit effects and also bring them a lot more power as well. Overall, for the range changes, to me, it feels like the most refined of the three styles, and that's a very good sign, because in December, before the holiday break, there was a beta that was range changes only, and they clearly took on a bunch of feedback and made a lot of changes, and I was honestly pretty happy with ranged. At the end game, it played pretty fun, and even as a mid-game player, I was able to do things like Duo Solak at level 90 range, which is the kind of thing that you would not be able to do in the live game, or if you did, it would feel absolutely terrible. But especially when I reset my account all the way to level 1, I was very impressed by the way that range progressed. I was fed abilities at an interval that made a ton of sense, and slowly, gradually introduced synergies that were very intuitive and very easy to understand. I felt like there were significantly fewer noob traps, and overall, I thought ranged as a new player felt night and day different and better than it does in the live game. So overall, to me, these changes for the range combat style were absolutely worth it. But with that said, I did still have a couple nitpicks and a couple things I wasn't happy about. The first thing that I just thought was kind of weird is when I was shooting arrows at a target that was far away from my character, the arrows would appear underneath my character instead of appearing underneath the target. Just kind of a weird thing that didn't make a whole lot of sense to me. But outside of that, the only two things about early game range I didn't like were first, getting Deadshot as an ability that costs 100% adrenaline ends up just being an instantaneous noob trap. All of the 100% adrenaline single attack ultimate abilities have been buffed along with this beta, and they do significantly more damage, but still, when you compare them to the amount of adrenaline cost and the amount of damage you get out of an ability like Snapshot, they're just significantly worse. And Deadshot, I found, was not actually worth using at any point. And if it were up to me, I think they should just make these abilities cost 60% adrenaline by default instead of 100%. That's one of the upgrades that the Zuk Cape provides, but the Zuk Cape also makes them deal significantly more damage. So to me, decoupling those so that newer players can use these strong abilities and don't fall into a trap for building up to 100% adrenaline and firing off an ultimate kind of makes a good bit of sense to me. I'm not going to repeat this 3 times, but the exact same feedback applied both to Overpower and to Omnipower when we get into Melee and get into Magic, where the abilities were unlocked pretty early on, but they just weren't worth using at all under any circumstance. And I think that's something that I would want to see addressed. The last thing missing from early game range, especially when you compare it to Necromancy, is just a distinct lack of heals. I think it's also an important thing to talk about because one of the things that Necromancy does so well is you've got the Ghost, and the Ghost is fantastic. And even when you're looking at a combat style like Magic, you can get on Ancients and you can use blood spells, and it's actually a very effective way to heal, especially with some of these combat beta changes. For Melee, they've done some experimenting with making some of the abilities heal your character for a portion of the damage dealt, but for range, there's still just absolutely no sustain. And that to me isn't necessarily a huge problem by itself, but it was something that I absolutely felt in the early game, and I definitely did need to bring food. But speaking of food, they did one other thing in this beta that I absolutely love, and I think they should ship to the main game immediately, which is that they made 2 huge changes to how food works. The first is that instead of costing you 10% adrenaline per time you eat a solid food, you're only going to lose lose 3% adrenaline instead. And what this means is you can actually eat food as much as you want without losing adrenaline overall while you're building. So this way, food isn't a noob trap. And then the other change that they made that was actually really significant and helped out a ton is they've now made it so that your food healing doesn't require a specific constitution level in order to heal the full amount. So it's more on par with old school. Because as an early game player in the live game right now, you basically get an invent of very low level food like cakes or trout. It's the only food that you can eat that actually heals you properly, and then you have to bank every 30 seconds when you're trying to train. Being able to buy a higher level food or gather a higher level food and bring it into a combat encounter and actually have a very long extended trip felt absolutely amazing. And I think of all of these changes with the combat beta, as silly as it is to say, I think this food change is probably the biggest game changer for new players. So all that to say, I haven't fully decided if it's a bad thing that range doesn't have any like HP sustain because of this food change. But alas, I do think it's something worth bringing up and worth discussing, and I'd love to hear what you guys think in the comment section down below, because in reality, these styles are going to be compared to Necromancy, and of course, Necromancy has a ghost. With my range feedback done, let's talk about melee. I'm going to preface this by saying melee of the three styles felt the absolute worst of the three. There was a lot wrong with melee, and I have a lot of feedback. But first, let's talk about the changes. Let's go over them. I'll let you know what I like and what I didn't. For starters, I do not envy the J-mods for this because melee has the most abilities in the live game, and if they're trying to get the number of abilities down, they had to remove a lot of abilities. And of the abilities being removed, some of them are pretty important ones, abilities that are very well liked. And I'll give you some examples right here. Decimate, Havoc, Smash, Slaughter, and Destroy are all classic melee abilities that people love using and have loved using forever. So seeing those all on the kill list, oh, it hurts just a little bit. But there are also some abilities like Balance Strike, Forceful Backhand, and Kick that, probably aren't quite as important. Also on the kill list, we've got Massacre, we've got Blood Tendrils, we've got Forceful Backhand, Cleave, Quake, Frenzy, and Stomp, but is just one of the other melee stuns. Before talking about these abilities that have been removed, I think we should talk about which abilities have been modified, because some of these abilities have kind of been removed in name only, and their effects have been put onto other abilities. Let's talk about that right now. The first modification is bleeds. Instead of having Dismember, Slaughter, and then Massacre as three separate bleed type abilities, where Massacre now works as a bleed, what they've done is they've made them into one ability like Necromancy's Soul Scythe. So you hit Dismember, and then after you hit Dismember, it will turn into Slaughter. You press the same keybind again, your character will use Slaughter. You press the same keybind again, and then your character will do Massacre, which is like Dismember Recast 2. The first cast is unlocked at level 50, and then the recasts are being added at level 60 and 75, so you get your bleeds at a gentle pace. Dismember is just regular Dismember. Dismember 2, which was formerly Slaughter, is the same as Slaughter in the live game, and then Massacre is a brand new ability that does pretty significant damage. So there was something I liked about this, and then there was something that I didn't like about this at all. The thing that I liked about this change is, I think functionally for a lot of players, after your Berserk rotation when you're melee camping, you would put on a Masterwork Spear of Annihilation, and then you would use your 3 bleeds back to back to back. It might be like Slaughter, Tendrils, Dismember, whatever it may be. That's sort of the way that people actually use bleeds. You'd kind of stack them all back to back to back because they don't work with Berserk. So to me, making them all into one ability sort of makes a certain amount of sense. You can just use the same button 3 times, and it's actually almost a reduction of switchscape because you're not switching over every single individual bleed you're using them all back to back. But there was one thing that I really didn't like about this whatsoever, and the thing that I have a big issue with is Slaughter being second. The reason why Slaughter is a weird fit here is because Dismember is a bleed you want to put on any target and it will just work. Slaughter is an ability that is a complete waste of adrenaline unless you're fighting a target that can move. So you need to make sure you're fighting a moving target for Slaughter to be worth using. And then Massacre is just a strong bleed that is good to use. Because of this, with this 3-part ability, when you're fighting a target that can't move and you want to cast Massacre, you basically have to cast Slaughter before it, and that is just an utter waste of adrenaline. So to me, I think this would work a lot better if they'd swapped the second cast ability to something like Blood Tendrils, which is just a standard bleed that works. So to me, I think they should remove Slaughter or just make it its own ability and then bring Blood Tendrils to be the second bleed ability. And then that way, whenever you want to bleed and use your bleeds, you can throw on your spear or not, and then you can use the same button 3 times to use functionally the same ability 3 times in a row, but ramping up every time with a higher adrenaline cost. Overall, I don't hate this change at all, and it actually played decently well when I was doing some melee camping. Next up, Punish. We really like the identity of Punish as a niche ability that becomes more useful at the end of the fight. To better accentuate this, we've given Punish the ability to lower its cooldown based on whether it delivers the killing blow. This hones in on its identity as a fight ender, and it gives additional purpose during high enemy count situations such as Slayer. To me, this makes sense, and Punish has always been one of my favorite abilities. I think Punish is pretty cool, and being able to use it in a Slayer scenario to deliver the killing blow, I'm entirely fine with. I also think it should probably get a different icon and a different name because it's probably more of an execute than a punish at this point, but functionally, it works completely fine to me. But one thing I don't like about this punish change, and you'll see with melee in general, a lot of these melee abilities now don't move your adrenaline up or down at all. It's just an ability. It's not a basic to generate adren. And because of this, I actually found it very weird to use because when I hit an ability, I am used to, as a RuneScape player, seeing my adrenaline bar either go up or go down. And having so many abilities in the melee book where you hit a button and your adren doesn't move at all, it just didn't feel right to me. And I think for a lot of players, you use your adrenaline bar to indicate that you've actually used an ability. You see the bar do something, and that means that the ability you fired has gone off. So to me, I would actually want to see abilities like Punish and every other ability that I'm going to bring up in this blog that doesn't move your adrenaline at all to do something. I don't care if it's a low amount. I don't care if it's a low cost or it generates a low amount of adrenaline. I need my action bar to do something or else I'm going to get confused. But overall, Punish works completely fine here. What Adaptive Strike does is it's going to change depending on what weapon you have equipped. If you've got dual wields on, it's going to do what Decimate used to do. And then if you have a 2H on, it's going to be an AoE and it's going to do exactly what Cleave used to do. In general, I like the idea of taking an ability or two abilities and reducing ability bloat by making it into one ability that just does the different thing depending on what you have equipped. But the one thing I'm not terribly sure about is I'm not sure about taking the icon from the Sever ability, naming it Adaptive Strike, and then functionally, if you have dual wields on, it's Decimate. If you have a 2H on, it's Cleave. To me, that is a little confusing, and I'd almost prefer it if it was just like Cleave/Decimate. And then whatever you put on, the ability on your bar just changed to what that was. To me, that makes more sense than calling it its own different thing, and then it has the same name, but it does a different thing depending on what you have on. But either way, in general, I like the idea of this, and I think it makes a lot of sense for Melee to get some combined abilities in order to reduce keybind bloat and also reduce the amount of abilities in the book. The one other thing Adaptive Strike does is it gives you extra adrenaline, giving you 12% instead of the usual 9. And this is a really nice thing, especially for a short cooldown ability, because especially with Melee now, and especially at the endgame, Melee has a bit of trouble building and maintaining adrenaline. And that's why in the live game, a lot of players opt to switch to a crossbow and use Greater Ricochet as a melee ability. And to me, this is designed to sort of mitigate that a little bit, because along with these combat changes, you will not be able to do off-style Greater Ricochet and farm crits to immediately get a whole bunch of adrenaline. But in playing with this, I actually don't think it gives enough adrenaline to kind of offset that. And there were still a lot of periods for me where I was having trouble building adrenaline, and there felt like a significant period of time where after my Berserk, I was just completely out of juice, and I just had to spam my basic attack over and over and over again, and I honestly found it quite boring. So for me, I think they should absolutely crank the adrenaline on Adaptive Strike, and I would go as high as 15 or even 18%, where it just gives you double the adren of another basic ability every 5.4 seconds or every third ability. And I think that way it would play a lot better, and it would do a much better job of kind of mitigating the lack of being able to use off-style Greater Ricochet. And hey, when you're a newer player, more adrenaline just gives you a little bit more juice to work with. Next up, we've got Flurry. Flurry was always a bit of an odd ability. It only really became useful when turned into Greater, and while we like the use of Flurry to reduce Berserk's adrenaline cooldown, it wasn't something we wanted to bring into the base version as it would sit in an awkward place. Either the ability it affects does not become unlocked until much later, maintaining it as a noob trap early on, or you'd unlock it far too late to have it meaningfully impact your player journey. As well as this, Melee suffers somewhat from early game sustain, whereby you don't have any good ways to mitigate damage. To mitigate this, Flurry now heals a flat amount per hit plus a percentage of the damage dealt to make it more impactful in the early game during multi-creature fights, but it tapers off as you unlock more sources of healing in the endgame. I have a couple of issues with this. I think the logic is good, that hey, Melee needs more sustain, regular Flurry is bad, why don't we combine those two things together and make it sustain? But the thing that I find a little bit weird about this is, generally speaking, when you're training with Melee, you are much better off using a two-handed weapon, because the two-handed weapons have the AoE synergy, you get the Cleave, you get the Hurricane, you get the Meteor Strike, and these are all beneficial 2H, when you're training, you want to be using a 2H, and now they're going to make this sustain ability a dual-wield only weapon. To me, it feels a little bit of a clash there, where if you're trying to heal while you're also training at the early game, you're then going to have to swap to a dual wield and use Flurry. I don't think it's the end of the world, but I do think thematically it kind of doesn't perfectly fit. And I think if you're going to make a sustain ability, I'd much rather that ability be something that you can use with either 2H or a dual wield. Outside of that, though, the other thing I was going to mention is just the amount of HP you're healing is comically low from this, especially when you're a lower level player and you're not dealing that much damage. So to me, this was pretty well functionally useless, although I could see it being useful if they tweak the numbers just a little bit. The one other thing that was really frustrating about using Flurry is if you ever kill your target with Flurry, your character just stops. So even if you're fighting 8 different things, whatever your primary target is, if it dies, your character is going to stop casting Flurry. And if that's your source of sustain, that is a huge problem. And because of that, my recommendation is I think it'd be a lot more fun if Flurry was a self-cast ability. So you cast it and it goes off in the area around you, regardless of what you're hitting or what you're killing. And then that way you could actually cast Flurry and run around kind of like a living, breathing Beyblade and just always get your maximum amount of 8 hits and always get your heals. I think that would be a lot more fun to play, and I also think it would be a lot more functional too, because there's no worse feeling than using an ability that's meant to heal you, it instantly killing your target on the first hit, and just like that, you didn't get a heal. And then, of course, alongside that, Greater Flurry, which is currently used to reduce the cooldown of your Berserk, still does that, and it also still heals you the exact same amount as the regular Flurry. So that just kind of makes sense. The next melee change is listed as Berserk, but it's not actually Berserk, so we don't need to panic. It's actually about Fury. One of the things that melee really has as a problem is with these changes, they've removed so many basic abilities that it kind of feels like melee only has 2 basics that you can actually use like whenever you want to alongside the auto attacks. You've got your auto attack, you've got your new adaptive strike, and then you've got Fury or Greater Fury. And that's basically it, because all the other abilities like Punish or like Chaos Roar, they're very situational. They work in certain situations, they don't work in others. So you don't really want to build with them. And because of that, one of the ways I wanted to mitigate it is basically they make it so that as soon as you cast Berserk, your Fury comes off cooldown right away. So even if your Fury is on 15 seconds of cooldown, use Berserk and it comes off. To me, this is a good idea. It's completely fine that they did this, but it is not nearly enough to mitigate the lack of basic abilities with melee. And I found frequently, especially when I was using a lower level setup and when I was melee camping, I just felt like I wanted more different basic abilities to hit. And I got very bored just kind of spamming my basic attack over and over and over again. So cool idea, but to me, not nearly far enough. One other thing I'm going to mention about Berserk while we're here is I do not like that Berserk does not last nearly as long as the ultimate abilities for the other styles. I totally get that there should and can be some variance in how long they last, but Berserk lasting 19.8 seconds by default is just a crazy short amount of time, and I would almost be wondering if it's worth them decoupling the longer Berserk from Vestments. Vestments of Havoc are already best in slot, they have the best stats of any melee gear, and they do a bunch of different things that are all very beneficial to melee, and I kind of feel like this is one of the changes that I would rather was just something given to everybody than locked behind one specific set of armor. So to me, I think it'd be really, really good if they reworked Vestments slightly, and although it is going to be a nerf to my Vestments that I love very much and I grinded Zamorak for, I think in general, one of the most evident things that I experienced when I was playing melee in the early game as well as in the mid game is just that 19-second Berserk is crazy short. By the time you've used Berserk and maybe you've done a barge after that and you've bled one singular ability, all of a sudden you got 12 seconds left on your Berserk, and the downtime between Berserks just feels really, really long. So I think one of the things worth at least looking at, or that I'd love them to look at, is see if there's a way to make Berserk last just a little bit longer, because I think it'll make it a lot more fun. Next up, we've got Meteor Strike. Similarly to Incendiary Shot being changed to Imbue Shadows, Meteor Strike has been reworked to be less crit reliant, giving your Berserk a bit more consistency. Here's what Meteor Strike does. The first thing here that is really good is it now only costs 40% adrenaline. We talked about this before when I was going over the range changes, but that immediately makes your melee adrenaline buff a lot more accessible to the average player, and I think that's great. But here's what it does. First off, it's a regular AoE ability just like it was before, but then on top of that, it does 2 things. First off, all of your melee basic abilities generate 1.5x the adrenaline they did before, and then it also generates 3% adrenaline every 0.6 seconds or every single game tick for 30 seconds. Functionally, what this does is kind of fun, because thematically, it means you're going to Meteor Strike, you're going to go into your Berserk, and then while you're in a Berserk, your adrenaline bar is just flying up. And you basically need to use powerful abilities to spend the adrenaline as fast as you can to not like waste it replenishing. Which thematically, I think is actually pretty fun. I really felt like I was going Berserk, But in this initial iteration, it felt way undertuned. I had a lot less adrenaline than I would in the live game with like a regular crit buff, and to me, although the idea is good, I just think it's a little bit undertuned, and I would personally make it so that your melee basic abilities generate double adrenaline, and you could even go up on how much adrenaline it's generating every 0.6 seconds as well. Overall, the idea of this is pretty cool, but I'm a little bit less sold on the execution. But one thing I will say for sure is, to me, this definitely beats what you do in the live game with Meteor Strike, which is you use Meteor Strike, you get your crit buff, and then you put on a bow and you use Greater Ricochet, and your adrenaline just goes all the way back up to full. The next change is Pulverize, and it's very minor. Basically, right now, Pulverize is a dead ability that is a waste of adrenaline to use unless you use it with an exit kill where the adrenaline cost is reduced a bunch. And what they've done is they've just passed this adrenaline cost reduction over to the ability itself. So it's no longer a requirement to have an exit kill to be able to use Pulverize. And that sort of gets rid of one of the noob trap abilities. That's something I'm completely fine with. The exit kill is the single most powerful weapon in the entire game. The special attack is absolutely yoked, and to me, it doesn't need to be doing a bunch of other things too. That's fine by me. And then last but not least for the melee ability changes, they have changed Hurricane, and this was one of the ones that I also really didn't like, but I think it's salvageable. What it does now is you spin on the spot, it does 2 big hits, and then that secondary hit will hit up to 9 additional enemies if they are within 1 tile of you. But of course, if you're using a 2-tile range weapon like a halberd or a scythe, it will actually hit within 2 tiles of you. So it's actually got the same range as it does in the live game. By default, this is just regular Hurricane, but it also has one additional effect, which is that if you hit at least 7 targets, it instantly resets the cooldown. And this I did not like whatsoever. As fun as it was to stand in a room full of Abyssal Savages and just spam Hurricane over and over and over again until randomly I would hit 6 targets instead of 7, and then I would go on a 20-second cooldown where I couldn't do anything, it just felt way too feast or famine to me. And I think if you look at RuneScape as a whole, there are probably 5 or 6 different spots where this would actually be usable, where everywhere else, Hurricane is just an ability with a 20-second cooldown. My proposal for this is, I think what it should do is every additional target more than 2 or more than 3 that Hurricane hits, it should just reduce your cooldown by a flat amount and make it so that if it hits either 6 or 7 targets, that is enough to make the cooldown instantly reset. And then that way, using it on multiple enemies is still beneficial, even if it's not enough to fully reset it so you could just spam Hurricane forever. The last melee change before I give you my overall thoughts is a big change to the ability book, which is there is no longer an attack book and a strength book. There's just a melee ability book. And to me, that is a really good thing to do, although I still don't like the way these abilities are ordered. I understand ordering them by level unlock makes sense at a certain point and at a certain level, but to me, I think it would make a lot more sense to categorize them first by ability type. So you had your basic abilities, your threshold abilities, or your abilities that have a cost, and then your ultimate abilities, and they were all kind of in separate rows, and then they could still populate based on level at that point, so that when you unlock a new ability, you immediately know what kind of an ability it is based on how it populates down the list. But with that said, and in hopes that they change that at some point, I do think it's really nice that there's only 1 book, as it's a little confusing having 2. But they also did something else that I don't really like here. They've also made every melee ability require an attack level instead of a strength level. So now strength only serves to unlock weapons like the exit kill, and it offers increased damage because, of course, as you get stronger, you do more damage. But to me, I think it's a little bit weird that every single one of your abilities is unlocked via attack only, and I personally think it would be completely fine to have 1 book called Melee Abilities and have attack and strength level requirements funneling into that, especially with some of these melee abilities that really do have a strength theme. Overall, Melee felt the absolute worst at every single point of progression. At the end game, it just didn't feel like it made sense at all. I had a lot of fun using Berserk, and in that Berserk, it felt pretty good. I was even doing 500,000 damage in a Berserk, which is very comparable to the live game, but then out of my Berserk, it just felt like I had nothing meaningful to do. I had no adrenaline, I had no interesting basics to use. I was just spamming the basic attack more or less, getting up to full adren, and waiting until I could finally do something useful again. So to me, Melee didn't feel great at that level bracket, and earlier on too, it just didn't feel like the synergy was fully there. When I was using range, I was unlocking abilities in a way that made sense, and the progression was really, really awesome. It was smooth, it was easy to understand, and it was easy to follow. And for Melee, I kind of felt like I was getting a lot of anti-synergies as I was unlocking new abilities. You start with just a basic attack, and then you get Assault, and that's your builder and your spender. Then Adaptive Strike is great because it gives you more adrenaline and a little bit more damage, so now you can use Assault more often. But then after that, I unlocked Overpower, which is a bit of a noob trap. And then after Overpower that I didn't actually want to use, I unlocked Fury. And Fury buffs your crit chance of your next ability. But unfortunately, Fury doesn't work on channeled abilities, so there's no synergy there between like wanting to use Fury and chain it with my Assault. If that worked, that would be a great synergy and it would make a lot of sense, but because it doesn't, I just kind of felt like the melee book was leading me astray. Unlocking Hurricane was nice because at least at that point I had something that I could combo my Fury with that made a bit of sense, but then after that I got my first bleed, which was Dismember, I got my first stun that doesn't have a lot of use in a regular rotation, and then after getting my first stun I got the Punish ability, and Punish is actually a great ability in a bossing scenario to combo with Fury, so it felt like I got my first like actual decent synergy, but of course Punish is a very situational ability. It's something you don't want to use at all early on into a fight, and you only ever want to use it on the back half. The one other thing I was going to mention about melee that I do not like whatsoever is Barge had its cooldown randomly brought from 20 seconds all the way up to 30, and it also unlocks at way too high of a level. I think it's like in the high 60s or the low 70s. So to me, that is one thing that I'd absolutely want to see reverted, and it just felt very weird, one, getting Barge that late, and two, getting Barge that late with a higher cooldown for no reason. Melee already has the worst time getting around and the most limited mobility because you can't attack from a huge range like you can with Necromancy ranged magic, and to me, this was just a nerf for no reason, and I'd love to see it reverted. To me, melee is the style that needs the most work, and it's just not even close to ready yet, but I'm looking forward to trying it out in further iterations of the beta because I think a lot of the things wrong with it are salvageable. Some good examples of that are Adaptive Strike or Meteor Strike just not being balanced to be good enough yet, and I think if they play around with the numbers, they can get things feeling a lot better, but still, especially when I played on my brand new account with level 1 stats, there just didn't feel like a lot of synergy, and it didn't feel like a lot of the abilities were working well together in my kit, which I really didn't like at all. But now it's time to talk about Magic, because Magic also had a lot changed, but overall, I think at the end game, it probably felt the best of the three styles by an absolute long shot. And in the early and the mid game, it didn't feel perfect, but it felt a lot closer than Melee. Let's get into it. For starters, you're going to notice that Magic did not have nearly as many abilities removed. We've got Deep Impact, we've got Shock, Horror, we've got Rack, and we've got Metamorphosis. And Metamorphosis is kind of a slightly more controversial one, and I very much understand that because it's kind of a really fun ability to use. There is nothing I love more than using Metamorphosis inside of a Sunshine at Karapak and doing couchy tier damage where you just go absolutely crazy. Like, it's really, really fun, and I kind of like the idea of you use Sunshine when you don't need to move and use Metamorphosis when you do need to move. But clearly, the J-mods do not see the vision the same way, and I also do agree that it is a bit of a noob trap to use Metamorphosis in the earlier game just because of how short of an ability it is. As cool as it isn't worth the adrenaline, and I'm assuming it counted as a bit of a noob trap, and that is why it's up for removal. The other interesting ability to be removed here is Rack, and Rack is actually one of my favorite abilities. Not because the damage is necessarily good, but I really like the idea of being able to use Ice Barrage as an auto attack with Rack and dealing increased damage. And also, I really like using Exsanguinate for Rack and Ruin. I think it's really cool to have a basic ability that does like 12 or 13 or 14,000 damage if you get the right stacks for it, and I was actually pretty sad to see this one go. But with that said, let's talk about all of these ability modifications. The first one here is Concentrated Blast, and honestly, they didn't change that much about it. The main change here is that for Concentrated Blast, they've made it do less damage, but then they've made it increase your chance to crit more. This is a benefit to early and mid-game players because generally speaking, you don't get a high critical strike chance until you're in the end game. And this change is going to make it so that even if you don't have a lot of crit buffs, Magic is becoming the critical strike style, and you'll be able to crit even if you don't have any buffs. So overall, this is a pretty positive change, and also at the end game, for those who are concerned or interested, it does not make a significant difference to the overall power of Concentrated Blast. It's still a very powerful ability, and actually, it's still the most powerful basic ability in the entire game. So G-Conk's still good. They've just sort of changed a little bit about where your damage comes from, where it's more used as a combo ability to buff your next hit than the actual hits it does itself. Although, to be fair, the hits that it does by itself are also ridiculously strong. One other big change they've made to Concentrated Blast that is going to be really good for bringing some power back to the early game is Concentrated Blast is now a regular one single global cooldown channeled ability. So instead of the awkwardness of regular Concentrated Blast being something that you want to cancel after 2 hits, you can just do a regular Concentrated Blast and it will work in 1 GCD, and then you can fire off your next ability. This is really nice. I'm glad this was done, and I think it is completely valid to make changes like this to keep kind of the same identity that it had before, but just make it a little smoother to use. Next up, we've got Sonic Wave, where they actually did something pretty interesting that has been pretty well liked. For starters, Sonic Wave no longer shares a cooldown with Concentrated Blast, so you can conk and Sonic back to back, just like you could several years ago. And you're absolutely going to win some nostalgia points there. The other thing they've done here is they've made it so that it makes your next magic ability cost 20% less adrenaline, which functionally makes it a very, very powerful ability. Because if you think about it, it generates 9%, it makes your next ability cost 20% less. Functionally, this is a basic ability you can use every 15 seconds for a total of 29% adrenaline. So a whole lot stronger than Adaptive Strike and really, really useful. The next ability here is Dragon Breath, and there was some very funny commentary about this, because basically it's the same as it was before, but the one difference is it does extra damage if your target has been combusted, and it said here that it's to lean into the burn build, and I can't remember who said it, but somebody a few days ago said it kind of feels like for Magic, like the crit J-mod and the bleed J-mod are like fighting each other, and we're like waiting to see who wins out, because to me, Magic has now very much cemented itself as the crit style, and I always find it interesting when they're trying to add a lot of bleed stuff to it too. And I'm kind of at the point, and maybe this is just me being old and jaded, but I'm kind of ready for them to let magic bleeds die. I kind of just feel like you could just stop dealing with bleeds, stop doing bleed stuff. I just feel like it's never going to happen, especially since bleeds don't work in group combat, which absolutely should be changed, by the way, because you can override each other's bleeds. And the other thing too is bleeds are just way less satisfying to use. You don't get to see big numbers when you're using bleeds for the most part. So anyway, to me, crits are just a way better direction for Magic, and Magic is still doing this split identity thing where it has all these anti-synergies because you've got your bleed kit and your burn kit, but you also want to use both of them interconnecting. Still not a huge fan of that, but alas, Dragon Breath does a combust thing now. And speaking of combust, combust has been changed to an ability very, very akin to Blue Bloat. This is very similar to Necromancy's Bloat ability. Basically, it's got an 18-second cooldown. It hits 10 times for a total of 400 to 500% damage over time, and of course, it doesn't stack with things like Sunshine, which also isn't listed in the tooltip anywhere. The other big difference with Combust is now a spender. It's actually going to cost you 25% adrenaline to cast, and you unlock it at level 44. To me, I don't think they needed to do this with Combust or just make it functionally bloat, but for Magic. I still don't know why they're leaning into bleeds the way that they have, and in my opinion, you could probably kill this ability entirely, but hey, maybe you guys in the comments below will let me know that you absolutely love Combust and you think it's great, and I'm actually curious to see what you guys think about it, because for me, it just never really made a lot of sense. But yeah, if you're mage camping, you're going to want to use Combust when you're not in Sunshine, and as a lower level player, you're just going to use it whenever you have adrenaline for it on a new target. Next up on the chopping block, or the changing block, is Chain, and they basically did the same thing they did with Ricochet and Greater Ricochet to Chain and Greater Chain, where now they've brought the effect back onto the initial chain, so it does the same thing that Greater Chain does, just a lot less well. So for this one, Regular Chain is now going to make it so that your next magic ability against whatever was hit by Chain is going to do 75% reduced damage, but it's also going to hit those secondary enemies. This is a really cool thing, and this is something that I've been a fan of for a while. I like that they've done this, and now all of a sudden, Chain isn't like a trap of an ability that you'd use in your regular single target rotation. And all of a sudden, it's like your niche. You only use this in an AoE scenario ability, and the synergy is very simple. You want to combo it with something that hits hard, and it's going to do damage to multiple enemies. The one other thing they've done away with here is corroming, so now regular Chain is going to hit up to 2 additional enemies, so sort of like exactly what Chain now without corroming would do, and now Greater Chain just kind of has corroming built into it. It will hit up to 6 additional enemies, which to me is pretty great. And now for Magic, there is one new ability that is actually pretty fundamental and pretty important that we're going to talk about, and it is called Runic Charge. It's obviously using the icon of Rack, which I hope changes at some point, because I was very confused playing the beta, where I want to hit my Rack keybind, but then I remember that Rack is now a self buff, and it's not Rack, it's Runic Charge. But alas, Rack has been replaced with Runic Charge, which deals no damage, but empowers one of your next magic abilities. And this is an ability that I actually absolutely loved. I thought it was really cool. Here's what it does. You can use it every 30 seconds, and then depending on what ability you use next, it's going to do one of 3 different things. And that's going to allow you to cater it to your needs and to your rotation. So whatever you need in the given moment, you can use Runic Charge to make it happen. If you use Runic Charge and then use Greater Concentrated Blast, each attack is going to grant an extra 20% critical strike chance, and it hits 3 times. So basically, what this is going to do is it's going to give you plus 60% crit chance on your next ability, which is absolutely insane, and it's very strong. So all of a sudden, even if you're not using using crit stuff, you can basically get forced crits on your next ability every 30 seconds by going Runic Charge into Gconk. But you can also use Runic Charge with Greater Sonic Wave, and it's going to make your next magic ability cost 60% less adrenaline. So as you can imagine, you could use this even if you're at half adrenaline, and all of a sudden you could use Sunshine, and Sunshine would only cost you 40% adrenaline to cast, and then if you've got Conservation of Energy and a Ring of Vigor, you'd be sunshining for only 20% adrenaline. And then if you're training in an AoE scenario, you could use Runic Charge into Dragon Breath to do an absolute ton of extra damage on your Dragon Breath. This to me was really fun, and I actually really enjoyed this, because in a standard magic rotation, I would Runic Charge before the fight started, and then all of a sudden I'd have a very easy time getting my initial Sunshine set up. It'd be as easy as using Runic Charge, tagging the boss with Sonic Wave, and then all of a sudden I could Sunshine, I could Tsunami, and I could Fractured Staff of Armor special attack back to back to back. This is something that comes up a lot when people are getting into RuneScape combat for the first time. Experienced players are really good at getting all of their buffs set up really quickly and building adrenaline fast, but less experienced players will occasionally do this thing where you Sunshine, you slowly build up to the adrenaline for Tsunami, and then after that you slowly build up to the adrenaline for your Fractured Staff of Armor, and by the time you've actually got all of your buffs up, your Sunshine is about halfway to expiring. And to me, Runic Charge is an awesome fix for that, because all of a sudden it's really intuitive and really easy to get all your buffs up. I also really liked that when I have an adrenaline potion available, I'm going to use Runic Charge on my Concentrated Blast to give me more damage because I don't need the extra adrenaline. But when I'm mage camping and I don't have my adrenaline potion available, I'm going to use it on my Greater Sonic Wave to make sure that I can get my buffs set up faster. Overall, I really liked Runic Charge. I like the idea for it, but I did want to mention that it is not terribly balanced and they're going to have to tweak some numbers. I think it's a little bit too strong with Greater Concentrated Blast, and it's way too strong with Greater Sonic Wave. Being able to every 30 seconds save 60% adrenaline on an ultimate is crazy strong, and I think it has made Magic feel very powerful in the beta, where Magic was outperforming even what it does in the live game, where it's already very strong. I was absolutely cooking bosses, and as much as the gameplay was very fun and it was really good to use, I think it's probably a little bit overtuned. For Magic in the early game, I felt like I was fed abilities at a decent cadence, and I'll mention it again, but the thing with Omni Power costing 100% adrenaline, I'm still not a big fan of, and it still made it feel like a bit of a noob trap. But in general, I had a lot of fun building up my rotation, especially once I unlocked Runic Charge at level 38, and all of a sudden, in a training scenario, I was going to be using it with Dragon Breath to gain more XP and more damage. And when I wasn't in a training scenario and I was fighting a single target like Fleshhatcher or Makarnaz, what I would do is I'd use Runic Charge with Sonic Wave to save me some adrenaline and allow me to use more powerful abilities. While it felt simple, it also felt dynamic, and I very much enjoyed it. But there was one other thing with Magic that changed here that I thought was really interesting and compelling. They've made it so that every single spell in your Magic book can be just dragged to your action bar and used as a basic attack, meaning it'll generate 9% adrenaline, and it'll do like a comparable amount of damage that is decent. This doesn't matter too much for elemental spells because they don't really do a whole lot of anything. But as soon as you get to Ancient Magics in the mid-game, when your Magic level is somewhere between the 60s and the 70s, things get really interesting, because as an example, in this clip, you're watching me train Magic at Ghouls, where I'm just using an auto attack with blood spells over and over again every single time, and that's actually a really awesome way to train with Magic, and a really good way to sustain too. It's the kind of thing that I wish they'd done years ago, because it just makes sense. You should be able to auto cast a spell and it actually work, it actually build you adrenaline, and it actually give you a decent reliable heal. And it works the same way for things like Ice Barrage too, where if you need a freeze because you're doing a Zuck run, you just hit Ice Barrage on your bar, and your characters get an Ice Barrage once without swapping your auto cast spell. This is a change that I really liked, and it's a really good way to bring some sustain to mid-level Magic. Those are all of the specific thoughts on the three styles and all the specific abilities, but I also had some overall general thoughts that apply to all three that I wanted to bring up here. The first very obvious one is, I think with all of these combat changes, they need to do something to make bleeds work in group content. It is not listed anywhere, it's not in any of the tooltips, and to me, it is still very misleading. And the idea that if I use Combust and then somebody else uses Combust, theirs just overwrites mine and cancels it completely, a lot of people are going to fall into that trap for a long time, and I know a lot of people just don't like using bleeds in group content whatsoever because they just don't work. The other thing that changed in this beta is they tried out something where with dual wield weapons, you'd have a 2-tick global cooldown and also some abilities that were just 2-tick abilities, which means they go off in 2 ticks instead of the usual 3, and they basically just make everything move a little bit faster. On paper, I like the idea of this because it's an interesting way to add some combo abilities and some higher action per minute, where with some abilities you want to hit it and then hit the next ability right away. But in reality, I actually didn't like the feeling of this at all. And I think at its core, RuneScape is kind of a rhythm game, even if people pretend like it isn't. And I think when you're PVMing and you're learning a new boss, you get into the rhythm and the cadence of firing abilities, where as soon as I had certain abilities that I needed to use that just made everything go faster, it just threw me off my rhythm completely. It was the kind of thing that I thought I would get used to over time, but in reality now, at this point, I have spent over 20 hours on this beta, and I am not used to it whatsoever. So that's one that they should definitely look at, and I think they should just go with a 3-tick global cooldown, keep it that way. It's RuneScape, and maybe that's just something that RuneScape is. The one other thing I was going to mention as well is stuns across the board kind of got nerfed. Not only do you not unlock them until 54, which is the same level that with Necromancy you unlock Soul Strike, but you actually only get 1 charge until a much higher level, where you get 2 charges total. And to me, that's just not enough stun charges. I love the idea of using stuns as a leveling benefit. So let's say at level 50, you get 1, at level 70, you get 2, and at level 90, you get 3, but a maximum amount of stuns of 2 is just not nearly enough. I was imagining a scenario where I was fighting something like Necatra, where you've got 2 stuns that you need to do on the 2 scarabs, and you accidentally use one of your stuns on the boss. All of a sudden now, you just can't do the mechanics of the boss fight, and to me, that's a little bit harsh. And I also think when you're comparing the stuns of the core styles to that of Necromancy, it's not really a fair comparison, because Soul Strike is a mass damage area of effect stun, using a currency that you build earlier on just by firing a basic ability that is good. Whereas for these stuns on the core styles, they do almost no damage, they have fewer charges than you'd get with Soul Strike, where you get either 3 or 5, and overall, they just didn't feel nearly as good. So to me, one of the things that I'd like to see is these stuns be brought up a little bit, and I hope they come to the realization that these stuns should not be put in the same category as Necromancy's Soul Strike, which is really, really powerful in a lot of different ways, where these stuns just don't have nearly as much benefit, but they have the same level requirement, and they just don't work quite as well. Overall, when compared to the live game, setting my stats to 1 and replaying combat did expose me to a lot of issues and a lot of other things they need to clean up. Some good examples include finding out that you can't actually range or mage over any of the new fences that have been added to the game, as well as just like general stuff like combat style weaknesses being very prevalent early on and having difficulty finding monsters to train on, especially at the lower levels. But overall, I can say without a doubt, when compared to the live game right now, these changes do make combat easier, more intuitive, and more fun to get into if you're a new player, in my opinion. And that is without a doubt. I will say though, melee still needs an absolute lot of work, but especially for range and magic, these changes did make a massive difference and they helped a lot. In the mid-game, when I was PVMing with level 90 stats, I was able to complete content that you absolutely would not be able to do with the same stats in the live game with any style except for Necromancy. I'm talking things like Duo Solak, Duo Zamarok, and Duo Elite Dungeon 3 that went a lot better than I was expecting and a lot better than they would have gone in the live game. So overall, I think they've done a good job of at least bringing some power back. So for early and mid-game players, Necromancy isn't going to be the only route, but I still think they do need to look at Necromancy as a whole and make sure that they're bringing enough power back, especially when they're addressing things like healing, lifesteal, and sustain. And at the end game, obviously, that's where things are a little bit more scary. But I also need to remember that I'm one of the players that likes the current end game of combat right now, and I know how to do it. And I think the reality is this update isn't really for me. I think the goal of this update is to make things better for early and mid-game players and returning players without ruining the end game experience too much. And I'm trying to be very open-minded about it because I think the reality is this. A lot is going to change in this beta, and a lot of end game stuff is going to change. I think it's going to be really hard for them to fix the early game and the mid game and the early end game without changing anything about the upper end game. It's kind of an impossible task, so I'm trying to be open-minded for the good of the future of the game. And I think as long as they do a good job of taking and implementing feedback, I think we can have a pretty good-looking combat system by the end of February when this update is supposed to launch. But with that said, I'm going to pass the question off to you guys. What do you think about all of this? I think it's a massive step, it's a massive change, but overall, I'm going to stay cautiously optimistic. I think they've done a pretty good job so far, and for the first iteration and for the first beta, especially for the melee and the magic changes, I think they're onto the right idea, even though the implementation hasn't been perfect. With that said, thank you all so much for watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more RuneScape content. Take care of yourselves, and once again, I did want to apologize for how long it took me to get this video out. I just didn't want to be someone that just read the news post and made a bunch of snap decisions on what I liked and what I didn't. I wanted to actually play the game, and play the game at a lot of different levels as well, and I'm glad that I had the chance to do that. So anyway, let me know why I'm dumb and wrong in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.